So welcome everyone to this month's version of the ReproNim webinar. We are super excited to have Pierre Herholz with us today. He'll be talking about extending the ReproNim's mantra that everything matters into the domain of machine learning and some applications that are motivated and take advantage of some of the ReproNim technologies, the ReproNim way. Just by super quick introduction, Pierre got his bachelor's degree from the University of Leipzig and a master's degree in neurolinguistics and neuropsychology, and a second master's in cognitive and integrated systems neuroscience, and a PhD in computational and cognitive neurosciences at Philipps University in Marburg. I think I will leave any additional introducing to Pierre himself and turn the floor over to you, Pierre. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for stopping by. I think I know most folks here, so it's very nice to see all of you. And yeah, I mean, so regarding this presentation, I mentioned it to Julie and Dave before. It's the first time I will ever give this presentation. So try my best here. Let's see how it goes. I'm always open to feedback and questions all the time. Just pop them out once you got them in. And one more important thing, of course, like with basically all presentations of this kind of type, there's an inherent bias to it, right? Based on the things I did in the past and how I approach things. And all of the things you see might not be like the one true or whatever only way, right? So please keep that in mind as like a first thing. And the second thing, we will do some actual analysis in this presentation, but these analyses are by no means like a gold standard go-to thing you should try to do yourself at home, in terms of they're not the most suitable analysis. They're just meant to be quick examples that I know can run in a very short amount of time to showcase some things. Okay, so please keep that in mind as a second thing. Okay, so let's get to it. The way this is gonna work is that we have the slide deck here, and within that slide deck, they're gonna be code sometimes, and they're gonna show some things. And based on that, sometimes the transition between slides can be a bit laggy. So trying my best to cover that up. Okay, and as Dave mentioned, I did a bunch of things in the past and then actually never did machine learning or had any courses in it. I just went for it at some point in time. And now currently, I'm still a member, luckily, of a ReproNim, very happy about, and also am a research affiliate working with Chevy Pauline, who is also ReproNim member at McGill. And basically also part of a bunch of other initiatives out there that are really happy that I could join those and support those. Okay, enough said to that. Let's get into it and talk about how everything matters, as Steph already said, the ReproNim mantra, and how this might be situated or applied to in machine learning, at least regarding some pointers. So let's imagine the following scenario where I think none of us here is a student anymore, but maybe in the past, there have been occasions like that, or we know people that do things like that, where a PI tells a student to run some machine learning analysis on some data. Specifically, one should use resting state connectivity to predict age of participants, something that's definitely been done before and happens quite a few out in the wild. So folks start doing it, apply, for example, here a random forest model, which is a form of decision tree, and then do their thing. However, before we actually do that, it might be a good idea to step back and define some of the things we're going to talk about over and over again in this presentation, starting with machine learning. When we say machine learning here, we mean basically a subset of artificial intelligence. Importantly, machine learning in it also contains deep learning. So whenever I say machine learning in this presentation, this means both the classic machine learning, the shallow machine learning, but also deep learning. And if there is a specific example for shallow machine learning and more specialized deep learning, I will say that. Okay, but this is basically the conceptualization we will use. Second, talking about components and steps. Rather classical, we have some input that is X with samples, in our case, participants, for example, and features. Can be any sort of input that you have. Of course, for us, interesting neuroscience, neuroscientific neuroimaging data. We might do some pre-processing to the features, apply some model with some estimator, obtain a matrix to get an output. For example, could be a clinical measure, could be something related to behavior, a segmentation of a brain image, whatever you might do in there. Could also be a transpose of the input X. It really depends on what you do. But basically, we have an input, a model, and an output. And last but not least, I guess that's something we don't have to super go into depth here. When we talk about reusability, we of course mean applying the same analysis to the same data and then hopefully achieving the exact same results through reproducibility. So, but now let's actually look how this example work out. At first, we get some data that was prepared before, which we then can inspect. And what we have here is basically a whole brain connectome flattened out as a vector. So 2016 connections in the brain from 155 participants. And to give you an idea how this might look like, at least roughly, basically these are all our connections, right? So features, and our participants are assembled here. And for each of them, we have this amount of 2016 features, which in neuroscience, neuroimaging, and other comparable applications would be referred to as a low and high P problem, because we have a small amount of samples, but a high amount of features. So we have the first thing. Next, we're going to get our labels, because we also have to know the ground truth to evaluate our algorithm on, right? And here, we're just gonna grab a CSV file that contains, for 155 people, their age group. So basically the variable, their demographic information that we want to predict. As we can see here, it's basically adults and 3 up to 8 to 12-year-olds with various amounts of samples in our data set. So having that in place, we can already import our functions from Python, of course, using scikit-learn, define a quick pipeline where we scale our features and apply a random forest classifier. And with that, it's like a line of codes. We can already run our machine learning analysis. That based on the data, usually, as you can see here, in a few seconds is done. We can then expect our outcomes, so the accuracy to prediction of our model for each of the 10 folds that we applied, our cross-validation folds, and of course also overall taking them in across folds, seeing that we reach an accuracy of 0.5 with a chance compared to a chance level of 0.16. So that's pretty good already, because machine learning, everything is great and we can achieve these amazing outcomes. But obviously we want to do more. It's maybe not fancy enough, because since a couple of years, there's this amazing thing called deep learning with artificial neural networks, and quite often they even perform better. So let's see how this works out in our case. Instead of scikit-learn, now we use the Tensorflow Python package, specifically the Keras subpart of it, import our functions, and then to keep it light and breezy, we define an artificial neural network with only 4 layers. Just a very short one. Set that up also in no time. Then we divide our data set into training and testing sets, which was done automatically before using the scikit-learn functions. And then we can already train our model. And again, this is by no means a good example of how a deep learning analysis should work, right? This is just for the sake of the presentation. So as you can see here, with only 300 epochs, a very light batch size, because we only have 155 participants, in only a couple of seconds, our deep learning model, as you can see here, 13 seconds, our deep learning model was trained and is now already basically ready to go to predict. But at first, we can see if learning success was somewhat there, and we see, okay, and in the beginning, our network really learned something, but then it kind of like plateaued, which sometimes happens depending on the data and the architecture, right? But having seen that, okay, something apparently was done. We can see how it performs in our test set. And we get an accuracy of 0.6. So even one additional point better than the random forest analysis using shallow machine learning. So based on that, we could say amazing, right? We did it. Everything is good. But is it really? Because what happens next is quite often, in this case, DPI tells everyone else, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. Now everyone in the lab should run machine learning analysis. So you should share your analysis script with everyone else out there. And if your colleagues in the lab immediately try it out using the exact same version of the script and data. And what I show you next is actually real life. So I actually asked 5 friends of mine to do that. And what happens, or happened, and it usually happens, is the following. All of them do get different results. For the random forest, we get a range from 0.52 to 0.58 in the accuracy. And for the deep learning analysis, we even get a range from 0.45 to 0.74, which sometimes here might not seem like a big difference, but just think about what it means when you actually want to put that model to a test and predict something very, very important, like disease status, therapy progress, and all of the alike. So this is really a problem. And the worst part is, it's not only your friends and colleagues that get different results, you also, yourself, if you rerun the same code on the same data on your computer, you will get different results every time you run that code. And just to show you that, what we do here in the first line, on the first cell, rerun our random forest again. Again, same code, same data, and see, okay, there's quite a big difference there already. And if we run our deep neural network again, this might take a bit longer. Let's see how it goes. Also here, maybe not like a super prominent difference, but still a difference, which we of course won't like. We don't want to have that, because we are of course interested in reproducibility also when it comes to machine learning analysis. So what is going on here? So that's a major problem. And the inconvenient truth is, when it comes to these kind of machine learning analysis, it's basically as with any other thing you do in your imaging or any other research field, there is such a substantial amount of factors that contribute to a certain analysis and an application being reproducible that it's just very hard to come by and really comprehend what's going on, except to really dig into these things. And the problem with machine learning analysis is that due to the complex nature of the analysis, a lot of the problems we're usually facing already are actually elevated. So the question then would be, okay, yeah, this is all very bad. So, but why do we even care about reversibility in machine learning? Here are some ideas gathered there. We all know the reversibility crisis in imaging is a thing for a bunch of years now. Some people still don't believe it, but I guess sooner or later they will come to it. But we also know that neuroimaging is by far no exception to the rule when it comes to research, right? Because basically everything else, like all research fields, have comparable problems. And this also includes machine learning. In the last couple of years, more and more research was done and like initiatives initiated, because the reversibility crisis in artificial intelligence became more and more of a thing, because more and more people did apply artificial intelligence algorithms in their research and in industry, basically everywhere. And besides being a major shortcoming overall when it comes to scientific practices and results, the question would be, what are crucial aspects when we're talking about reversibility in machine learning here with a focus on neuroimaging specifically? First of all, it is all about understanding, explaining, debugging, and reverse engineering. When we talk about reusability, it can tremendously help with understanding, explaining, debugging, and it's actually crucial to reverse engineering. And why is this important? I guess it depends on who you ask, but machine learning is very difficult to understand, explain, and debug because everything is super complex. And once you get unreproducible outcomes there, it just makes it increasingly harder to understand, explain, and debug things. And if outcomes are unreproducible and we don't understand what's going on in the first place, we might not be even able to actually get to the point of reverse engineering anything. And applied to our example, for example, what we would like to know is that why our model provided us with the obtained accuracy that we got, what did our model learn from the data, if anything, if there are certain features in our data that are more prominent than others. These are questions you would commonly ask in such an analysis. But the problems we're facing here is that we do get a different analysis at every run, and we cannot really be sure because of that what our model learned from the data. And we cannot be sure that certain features might be more important than others because this would also change upon each run instantiation. The second point would be correctness, because reversibility helps with correctness via this first point, understanding and debugging. And why is this important? We want to be sure that the results and effects we see in our analysis are actually something that is there, that is trustworthy, not only a fluke. Because if we cannot trust these results and they're actually not correct, we cannot pursue these things in science called knowledge generation, actually advancement of our understanding of the world. And for example, more and more researchers utilize machine learning to make predictions about humans. Again, as said before, group clustering, treatment therapy plans, disease propagation. And if you have an unreproducible model prediction, this can really lead to devastating errors because at some point, human lives will be involved, and that's no good. For our example, we wanted to be sure that our model learned something like a way to reproducibly predict the age of participants from this resting state connectomes. The problems we are still facing is that we cannot be sure that this was actually done, like that our model actually learned something because the outcome varies. And we basically cannot trust our model. This leads us to credibility. Easily reproducible results at overall, but also in machine learning, are just more credible because we want fair, verifiable, reliable, unbiased, and ethical analysis and results. And I guess a lot of us are already aware that in the near future, a lot of very important decisions that will impact lives will depend on results from machine learning analysis. Again, in neuroimaging and in medicine, but also finance and basically everywhere else. And we already saw stunning examples of how easily things can go tremendously wrong. For example, the whole Google image capture tagging thing and the biases that all these deep learning models have. It's just not good. And for our example, we want to rely actually that our model can predict age from resting state connectomes. That is in a way that is verifiable, unbiased, in certain ways, if at all, hopefully ethical and fair. And none of these requirements are currently fulfilled because our results are not reproducible at the moment. And this leads us to extensibility. Reproducibility also helps with that because quite often machine learning analysis they become extended, right? It's just not like a given set, but quite often there are successive steps in those pipelines. So if the first step is unreproducible, the rest most likely is as well. And so given part of any machine learning analysis here, feature engineering, a certain type of layer in artificial neural network, if they are not producible, then the respective analysis or later parts in the pipeline, they cannot be extended. right? Because the post-processing options, data augmentation, all of that is not feasible or possible if the initial model or some parts of it is working in an unreproducible manner. So for our example, we want to extract features, let's say, important for the prediction, and we would later on then would want to augment our model with new features from a different modality, diffusion or behavior or something like that. But we cannot be sure that the importance we extract right now is for the features is actually reliable. So we actually cannot go to the next step of augmenting our model because we have unreproducible results. And last but not least, it's data harvesting. Reproducibility helps with model training for data generation. We all know that any type of machine learning analysis needs tremendous amounts of data to be trained, evaluated, and tested on. So, and due to the lack of data sharing practices that are still unfortunately common, and also standardization, including quality control of that, there's usually for most of the things people do, there's just not enough data for most planned or even currently conducted analysis. And this is especially true for certain types of data, for example, with very low prevalence in the population, or like broad spectra, for example, in ASD. So generation of synthetic data using machine learning, for example, GANs, a type of deep neural network, this offers cool and amazing possibilities to address this problem. But for this to work, the synthetic data to make sense and be reliable, the model needs to be reproducible. So if we want to do that and generate data based on the one we have, this basically right now in the way we have it wouldn't really work because the model performance and because also the derivation of our data is not reproducible. And at this point, you might think, this is just not good. I've said not reproducible a lot of times in the last couple minutes, and this is obviously a problem. And there are so many things to consider that it can go wrong. And then that even this was basically just the top layer here that I addressed. And there's so many more things we didn't even get to. So the important part is now that we shouldn't give up, but instead look at the underlying problems and how we can address them. Starting out with the challenges we're facing in reproducible machine learning, basically the underlying factors that contribute to the variability we saw and the unreproducible results and all the problems thereof that exist. The other inconvenient truth in talking about that is that every single aspect involved in machine learning analysis creates variability, as with any type of other analysis. So all of that is a major hurdle towards actually achieving reversibility. And not only does this entail the computational infrastructure, but also the data, practices during analysis, application of the analysis, all of that in there. And there's a great post from, I'm not sure if I pronounce, pretty sure I don't pronounce the name right here, Hydra Ml, where there's an amazing blog post, several blog posts actually on reproducibility in machine learning. And I highly recommend you check it out. I took a lot of inspiration from this great piece of work here. That outlines that common challenges, very important challenges, are based on the hardware, the software, on the algorithmic and practices process level, as well as the data. So now we're gonna talk a bit about each very, very shortly. Starting with hardware. Machine learning algorithms require intensive computation and can take a very long time to run. Because of that, there's also specialized hardware that aims to address this, for example, using parallelism and multiple processing units at CPUs, graphical processing units at GPUs, or even tensor processing units at TPUs. While this is all very cool and helpful, there's a new problem, or they actually introduced problems concerning reversibility based on the underlying what it's called floating point computations. And this is something that appears independent of the hardware using in there. When we're talking about CPU, what we have there is what is called intra-ops and inter-ops, so within operation and across multiple operations. Because what happens there is basically when these things are mixed or you split these processes up, fair chance basically happens all the time that you produce different outcomes when run repeatedly. If you look into GPUs, you have these stream multiprocessing SEM units that lead to do asynchronous computation, also leading to variable outcomes during repeated runs. And if you change the underlying architecture of your model, or your model is using to run and train and evaluate it on, this will also change whatever is coming out of it. Talking about software, most commonly used frameworks for machine learning analysis actually on their sites and docs don't guarantee 100% reproducibility. That includes Qt, PyTorch, TensorFlow, all of these things. And that's, of course, always the danger of bugs, which can be hard to find based on these high-level APIs if you're not very familiar with these sorts of analysis or the software in the first instance. And because every computation requires a complex stack of software that interacts and has cross-dependencies, so you have the operating system drivers, for example, Python or Python packages, and all these have different versions. It's basically quite often not possible to just transfer one application or here an analysis to from one machine to another, at least in a way that you will have reproducible results and get the same outcomes every time. You have these numerical errors and instabilities of the software, for example, including local minima and maxima and floating point precision, again here, because these errors you find in there in the software, they can lead to what it's called unstable functions, or they can lead unstable functions towards distinct local minima. So for example, if we run this line of code here, what we should get in the end is 1. But if we actually run that, we see even with this like very, very simple operation we run there, so basically just for 1,000 times, add these things up and take the sum of it, we get some inconsistencies in there, and that's of course of the floating point precisions here. Which leads us to algorithm, the next part. There are characteristics of quite a few machine learning algorithms that usually introduce further problems. And most of it centers or circles around randomness. And of course, this expectation of randomness that a lot of these algorithms have, those things can lead to unreproducible outcomes. And the complexity of computation and splitting across processes and all these different units, this can also lead to non-deterministic results. Which also, when it comes to practices and processes, basically this combines the former 2 points, which is software and algorithms, because bring that together and talking about this randomness again that you would have to deal with all the time in machine learning analysis, not properly addressing it will heavily influence the reproducibility of results. Because you, for example, have random initializations, random augmentations, random noise introductions in networks, data shuffles, terrain test splits, all these common operations depend or utilize randomness at some point. And here's just a brief example concerning data shuffling in our training sets. So what we do here, we split our data set in train and test 100 times, and then check out how often a certain label is in the train set, as you can see here, or not. And usually if you would have reproducible results and outcomes, there shouldn't be any variation in there, right? Because it should be the same split each and every time. But because we didn't address anything yet, throughout all these different repetitions and different runs, training and test set all base vary. And with that, obviously, outcomes will vary as well. When we're talking about data, big data is the buzzword here. Commonly ignored usually is that machine learning analysis actually really need tremendous amounts of data. And given that data standardization and management are still not frequently applied in a lot of cases, even in small data sets, big data poses additional major problems. Because when working with any kind of data, and especially big data, just think about, for example, the UK Biobank with hundreds of thousands of samples in there. Various aspects need to be addressed. You have data management, you definitely need to address data provenance. There can be data poisoning or under and overrepresented data that you use to train your algorithm on. And all of that it's just not good. And not only is this a concern like for the final prediction, but it also happens the entire time, like in all the steps before and everything that might come after, right? So feature engineering, augmentation, any type of processing, basically. So what comes to that is the limited reusability of models, because actually only a subset of models, a very small subset of models, is used more than once, which is grounded in two main factors. You have absent sharing of trained models, which is a big problem because training these models can take such a long time and consume such large amounts of resources. And if more people would share trained models or weights thereof, it would actually be a very good thing to reduce or opportunity to reduce these costs and actually could further validate models in terms of all of the things, reproducibility, reliability, robustness, and generalization. And that leads to another thing you would have to deal with in machine learning quite a bit, which is what people refer to as concept drift. Because for basically everything we do and things we investigate, also with machine learning, the concept of the world that surrounds us and the things we investigate within, this is changing. For example, think about disease, disorders, and subtypes, progressions of how much we learned in recent years, for example, of related to ASD or Alzheimer disease propagations and subtypes. And while we as biological agents can deal with that and make sense of that, we would also make artificial agents aware of this and tell them, oh, look, there's a new thing going on and this is changing. So we need to update our models. And this is actually referred to as continual learning in machine learning. So at this point, you might think, if there's all these problems, and if I run the same analysis twice on the same computer with the same data and same code, and it's with different outputs, what's actually the point of it? Why is anyone doing it? This is not good. Again, it's very bad, but we can do something to make it at least slightly better. So let's see what we can do. And now in that section, we're going to talk about pointers to increase reversibility in machine learning. The good thing is a lot of the work and efforts that's already done to increase reproducibility in neuroimaging, the same things can actually also be used to increase reproducibility in machine learning. And specifically, now we're at that point where it stops a bit. Here we go. This entails tools and resources provided by ReproNim, the different members thereof, as well as adjacent, like friend, colleagues, initiatives. So in more detail, we have a brief look, excuse me, at the following challenges and respectively helpful aspects that we can use to address them. When we talk about software, we can use virtualization of computing environments, for example, using NeuroDocker. On the algorithm practices and processes part, we can actually deal at least a bit with randomness. And talking about data, we can talk about standardization, for example, using bits, tracking everything that's going on, using version control, for example, like GitHub and DataLet, and obviously also share our outcomes. Unfortunately, regarding one aspect we're missing here, hardware, ReproNim doesn't offer hardware resources yet and send those around. So we have to keep that aside for now. But maybe Dave and others, that's something that we could do there and talk about. So, sorry, here we go. Starting with software. As mentioned just before, every computing environment is composed of many different aspects: the operating system, drivers, Python packages, all their versions. And again, we can just not send machines around via a proposal, right? So what can we do to address this? And I think to basically everyone here, this comes to no surprise that the thing we can do is actually make use of virtualization technologies, because with that, we can isolate the computing environment and provide a mechanism to encapsulate these environments in a unit that we can then run basically everywhere. So we reconstruct it and we share it. which basically allows us to address of these software dependency issues. And overall, there are several types of virtualization across these different levels in your machine. So we would have pure Python virtualizations, VM and Conda, software containers like Docker, Singularity, and also virtual machines like VirtualBox and VMware. So sorry, now we're at the point where the presentation gets a bit laggy. As said before, machine learning, again, need a lot of computational resources to run at least in a somewhat feasible amount of time. So usually you want to make use of HPCs, so high performance computer clusters. And this more or less excludes virtual machines from suitable options because them handling, management, and resources allocation doesn't really scale that nicely. In contrast, if you use Python virtualization and software containers, those work reasonably well in HPCs regarding both utilization and management, as well as resource allocation. And when we talk about these computing environments, that is creating them, combining these different virtualization types and management them, we can actually make this incredibly easy and even reproducible, because we could use NeuroDocker, which most of you folks here know that, is a containerized software aimed at the reproducible generation of other containerized software. And with that, we can actually use Python virtualization and using Conda, and as well as Docker and Singularity. And if we wanted to include that as well, neuroimaging specific software. So the question folks might have is why we need both. So the problem is if you only use Python virtualization, this usually does not account for libraries and binaries on other levels that are beyond Python. And for this, to also include that, libraries and binaries, we need software containers because they share the host system's kernel. So for example, the HPC machine or your local machine, and they can include everything from libraries and binaries upwards, which is really what we want in this case. And in order to create a software container, here we, for example, use Docker, it entails a Python environment with all the packages and the versions that we use or that I use to run the initial analysis. You only would need to following using NeuroDocker. And I'm not currently running it because I will actually build the container. It will take a long time. So I did that before. But it's just to show you how comparably easy with only a few lines of code using the NeuroDocker image here, we can create a full-on software environment, a software container that runs on Ubuntu 18.04 and has our Conda environment with all the modules and the versions that we need. And we define it in a way that whenever the container runs, it automatically executes or runs the underlying Python. So we only needed to provide it with a Python script, for example, that will then be executed inside the container. And again, I'm not running this right now because it will take a long time. I did that before, so I can show that. Sorry, just gonna be a sec. There we go. As you can see here, just using Docker images, you can see all the Docker containers that I have currently on my machine, where we have the NeuroDocker one and the ReproNim _ML one, the one we would create with the comment from before. And once we have that ready to go, what we can do again is basically run or execute this command or this Docker software container in a way where we provide via a mapping, as you can see here, we provide our Python script containing the analysis that we want to run as an input, make that available in the container, and run the container. I cannot run this in this presentation, but I can run this in my terminal. So this is the same command, just copy paste it out. And if I give that a code, obviously it's not working because I've made a typo, but we should be able to fix that. There we go. So what's happening now is the Python script with all the machine learning analysis I run before here in the presentation is executed in this software container entailing all the software and the specific versions in a way that I can, for example, share it with other people, put it out there, and we're going to see later on how this might look like. But the important part is that now here we have an encapsulated environment that is actually being able to share, allowing us to address the software compatibility issues. And then at the end here, we get our outputs, which is also then written again to our host machine. So having dealt already basically with a large portion of software dependencies, we can look at the next part, which is algorithm practices and processes. And what we can do there, or what we focus on there, is basically this randomness that is everywhere in the world of machine learning. Because while often expected or required by algorithms, if it's not done right, in quotation marks, you would actually get reproducible and unreproducible results. So what can one do about this if it's something that is needed, but also needs to be addressed? Simply put, what you need to do is to set what's called the seed of the randomness. You need to seed the randomness in your machine learning analysis. Because all software you use has the option to set a seed for randomness one way or the other. And where and how this seed can be set, unfortunately, varies between software packages. So one definitely has to check the specific docs and info there. And as another downer here, often it's actually required that the seed needs to be set at different instances. And regarding these things, there's no one solution fits all kind of thing going on. So definitely, whenever you run machine learning analysis, make sure to check the docs and the respective information of the tools you're using. Applied to our example here, starting with the random forest, in the beginning, we didn't set the seed for randomness, right? So whenever we run it, now we just run it 10 times in a row, we will get 10 different outputs, more or less variable, right? As you can see here, the only thing that remains constant is the chance level because we don't include more labels. It's just the same, but the accuracy and the mean absolute error, all these things change at each run, at each iteration of our model. And obviously, this is not okay because how should we choose which one to trust and utilize further, right? So what we can do now to get rid of that, at least to some instances, is here in these functions that we use in scikit-learn, it's the what it's called random_state argument. And if we set that to a certain integer, this is our seed. So with that, we seed randomness. For example, here, when we do our cross-validation, that splits our data in train and test. And here in our random forest classifier again, this was what I meant with you have to set it at different instances to be sure to get more reproducible results. If we run that, we should get the same. Sorry, now I can't scroll anymore. We should get the same outputs at each and every run. So we don't see, unfortunately, everything up to run 10, but I say now the thing no one ever should say in science, just trust me, it will reproduce the same things at each and every run because we did set the randomness. And if we now go to our artificial network, this actually is already more complicated. So first of all, we obviously set the random state seed again when we train, when we split our data set into train and test data sets. Because as before, so it's the same code we run before, we see at each iteration, here 100 again, we get a different distribution of labels in the training data set, test data set, sorry. And now we don't see it here. Oh, there we see it, okay. But if we set this one argument, the random state, what we see is that at each and every single iteration and run of our model, we do get the exact same split into train and test data, which is already very good and useful. Now going further, and this is more or less where the fun starts, I would say. So we would also need to set the seed across various parts of our computational environment and within these deep learning analysis frameworks here, TensorFlow. Without that, again, we get different results at every run. So what we do here is run the same model, the same neural network as before, just 10 times again. As you can see, more or less variation in there. At each and every single run. So now, in order to make that more reproducible, that is the results we get in the end, what we need to do is we need to set the seed, for example, here the random seeds in the entire environment, the Python hash seed, the random seed, and also the NumPy random seed. So all of these software parts that do play a role when it comes to randomness in this kind of analysis. And we also need to set the TensorFlow seed, which happens right before we fit our model, which you can see here. And if we do that, what you can see here is a very good example of how things cannot even then fully be reproducible, because here we see the first run actually differs. The last are basically all the same. And most likely what happened here is that from the first to the second run of our model, because there's a lot going on my machine right now, it switched to a different CPU. This was this multi-processing option. We outlined as a problem before. So even when setting all the seeds, this still can happen. So make sure to watch out for that. And for our again, super minimal example, this might be sufficient and work out. But if you have more realistic artificial neural networks, this wouldn't be sufficient at all. It would require way more steps to actually fully achieve reusability in the best case scenario. And this, for example, includes setting an inter and intra-OP parallelism so that you use only a certain amount of threads, which unfortunately brings up the computation time by an order of magnitude. But you could also address this determinism using the OSS environment variables. And there's actually specific packages for that right now out there. For example, the framework determinism that reintroduces or brings determinism into machine learning analysis. So if that's of interest to you, definitely make sure to check those out. With the respective solution, definitely depending on your computational environment, the model architecture, the data you have, and unfortunately sometimes might not even exist, at least with an implementation that is somewhat reasonable and feasible to do. And this ongoing concern of reversibility issues and variance variability became a new field of study itself and has a lot of very fascinating and helpful outputs out there. And I can highly recommend this paper here called Accounting for Variance in Machine Learning Benchmarks, which really goes nicely into detail there and addresses a lot of the aspects we talked about. Definitely a recommended read if that is of interest to you. And something you should know nevertheless if you start working or currently working with these analyses. Now going into data standardization, tracking, and sharing. Can't stress this enough. Data is crucial, and anything or everything that's adjacent to data is crucial as well. So the idea here is really that if we manage to do or obtain standardization of data models, this will allow us to facilitate and get better management of data, quality control, and increase fairness. Entailing also keeping track of everything we do using version control and sharing whatever we do and get out of it, that is data and models, to then maximize reusability, fairness, and ideally also reduce computational efforts. Because if everyone has to retrain every model again, that will very soon become a problem. and starting out with standardization of data and models. Not only themselves, but also the description. If we do that, it will help us, and we already know that by things the community already implemented regarding reusability and other aspects. And as I said before, big data is even more on the preferable end of this, because when we, for example, can combine human and machine readability of the entire data set, but also the metadata, we can efficiently, or way more efficiently, handle data management, evaluation of our data set if there's something missing, over underrepresented, quality control, data documentation, and all the things we discussed before. And when it comes to standardization things, again, no surprise here. One of the best options to tackle this is, of course, the brain imaging data structure, or bits, because with that, we can have the best of all these things, basically, we are currently talking about, and that is we're not having just some random quotation marks data that is floating out and around, but is in a certain structure that is understandable for us as humans. We can immediately make sense of that, and also for machines. So the entire handling is just way easier. And bits obviously started out as brain imaging focused, fMRI focused standards, but is actually more and more evolving. And it's entailed this directory structure, naming conventions, open standards intended for human reusability. We already had that. We have metadata for all the files, and we have this clearly structured open community that works on it. So bits is more and more extended. And this, again, could also relate to the concept drift, and that is, how do we talk about things, how we perceive them, how we utilize them? With one thing that should be outlined here, and specifically to machine learning analysis, is that bits is also being extended in the realm of models. And not only does this contain stats models, statistical models of any type of neuroscientific data, but also in a dedicated BAP, the computational modeling. So how do we go forward with standardizing computational models? What can be done there? And this brings us to the version control part, because again, our example here is very, very small and short, but if you've ever worked with like a real world machine learning analysis, they are very complex and a lot happens along the way. And that leads to analysis code, input data, and output, what we get out there, also changing with those influence changes. So if we do not keep track of these frequent changes, reproducibility is basically not possible. And one tool to address this obviously is version control, which in itself has different forms depending on the data you might want to use. But for example, when we talk about, just waiting for the next slide, most things here, the well-known software is Git, because with quite a few software packages and platforms out there, for example, GitHub, GitLab, but also DataLab, building upon this, it's really an insanely useful tool that we can utilize to also increase reversibility in our machine learning analysis. So placing on everything that we have under these version control systems, all the aspects in there. So data doesn't only mean the data set itself, but also the code we use, the inputs, the outputs. If that is currently monitored and changes tracked, we will become aware of certain problems or sufferability and can address them to increase reproducibility of our analysis. So if our machine learning analysis Python script, if we apply certain changes and the outcomes varies as a result, using version control, it's easy to figure out what happened and also restore previous versions or take it from there depending on the problem at hand. So for example, here, that's just the Python script that I used here already out in Gitline, checking different versions. And we can see here, for example, within this commit, I wanted to make it more reproducible. and thus included these random states in the different parts of the code, which you can nicely see summarized based on version control, and can take it from there then. Or if I would have introduced a problem and error, can revert back to the original version. And while these code version controls using Git, GitHub, GitLab is fortunately more and more common version control for other forms of data, especially data sets, it's not, which for the huge data sets we're dealing with in machine learning analysis, becoming really a problem, right? So, because what happens when we run multiple machine learning analysis on the same data set, and this yields different outcomes? How do we keep track of that? Because that's also something we usually wanted to know, what happens at what point in time and why. And one up and coming tool, again, no surprise here for the folks, is DataLad, because it allows us to easily track changes in basically all kinds of data, not only code, but data sets themselves, like all the different files that you might have out there. Because we can create version control data sets of any form and monitor every change that appears along the way, including inputs, outputs, files in general. The software use, basically like everything you have, DataLad can basically put version control under it. And if we do it with our machine learning analysis, this could look as follows. And I already also run these lines of code because otherwise it would take long in the presentation. Okay, so you already see the output here. But what we do is we just start out with creating a new data set using DataLad, which is then automatically everything in there in itself placed on the version control. We download our data set again, but not within the Python script, but using DataLad, because we also want to make sure that that data set itself as an input to our analysis is version controlled. And then can use one of DataLad's amazing functions, applying directly what it's called the Yoda principles for us to create a directory structure for the project and analysis. Quite often, in this case as well, this entails a data and a code folder. So if we just run this command, this will be created for us with README files and again placed on the version control. Then what we do is basically get the data set that we previously downloaded as the sub data set and clone it into this newly created data directory, into the raw folder there, because we want to make sure that we understand and keep track of this as being the raw data as an input to our analysis. And in the next step, it actually gets already kind of fancy, I would say, because what we then do is use the software container I previously created and I already showed you, but now we download it directly from Docker Hub, from this place in the internet where these Docker images can be stored, and add it as a software container to our dataset. So now our dataset, our entire project, not only entails the data that we have, but the software environment we use to run the analysis. So everything we do with that, its application, that's version controlled as well now. And the last thing we need to add is only our script that executes the machine learning analysis, the pipeline that we saw before. So with all of that, we have the data set, we have the code, we have the software environment, all of that under version control. And now we can actually bring it even more together and run the analysis, as I did before, inside the container, but also keep track of the input and the output. So if we run this command, everything that we do in there and get out of there will be version controlled as well. And not only with that, we get reproducible results, because we have the data set, like everything under version control and the software environment to it. So we can check our outcomes produced from that. But here's the part that is actually about. And this is what I show you live now. We get a full log of everything that happened into our data set. So if we run this, what you can see, or not see because it's not scrolling right now, Okay, I'm just quickly changing the view so that I can show it. So what we can see here, if I run that, is that from the beginning of creating this data set, adding files, our data set, to it, setting up this Yoda principles with code and data folders, adding sub-data sets to it, configuring our software computing environment, adding our script, and then the run. So it is actually running our analysis with the inputs and outputs. Inputs here, outputs you can see here. Everything is in there, and it's in a way that we can directly reproduce, because we have this information here and can use, for example, data-led command rerun to just run it all over again in the same way we did it here. And in terms of reproducibility, that's pretty cool, and something we wanted to we would additionally have as a standard in these sort of analysis, and basically all other analysis as well. And there are some other tools out there that actually a bit more, because data-led is like just all purpose basically, right? There are tools out there that are more tailored towards machine learning. For example, this entails MLflow, a very cool library with different code versions, source parameters and metrics that one can define and utilize in machine learning analysis. And in itself, it also contains what is here called project files, where you can specify, for example, a Python environment, also inputs and outputs, but really, really tailored to machine learning analysis. So again, if that's of interest to you, definitely make sure to check that out. There's also Hydra Ml, which is done or created and managed by one of ReproNim's members, Sartre Ghosh, and his team, which not directly focuses maybe on reproducibility, but can be used to really nicely set up machine learning analysis in a reproducible manner and investigate outcomes compared to different models and the alike. So now that we already basically addressed software, algorithms, practices, processes, and data, we have a good amount of reproducibility already in our analysis, starting out from the first few lines where basically everything was different all the time. So what can we do more? And this really leads us to sharing data and models with just skipping all the points I already mentioned before. But the idea is that we do share data and basically all the types of data we have in there openly out there with restricted access if it's need to be. But the question here is really the right way. And this depends usually on the data at hand. And also obviously also includes that data and models and everything is standardized so that people can actually understand them. There is this large amount of different resources out there, including Figshare, OSF, Github, Zenodo, Data Dryad, OpenNeuro, or BrainLife, if you want to go into more neuroimaging specific things. And whatever tool you have to use or might want to use really, again, depends on the data at hand, right? Because, for example, talking about GitHub here, uploading like large amounts of data doesn't really work out there. But for example, the things we do here, this actually works out pretty nicely with GitHub because we can include the software and information regarding the computing environment there. So all of that is in the GitHub repo that is openly shared and people can check out. And the computing environment itself, so the Docker container we created before, so to have a computing environment that can be shared and transported, this is made available on Docker Hub. And these things can even be connected if people want, so GitHub and Docker Hub. Next, we also, of course, share the code on GitHub with the different machine learning scripts that we run within this example so that people can use them. Also here, see different versions of it because, again, it's on a version control. And last but not least, what we also do is share the pre-trained models, because what we did in our analysis, we basically added parts where the models and the weights, everything in there is saved after we run it, so we can actually upload it so that people then can reutilize it, load the models, load the weights, and directly apply to new data. And speaking of this model sharing and weight sharing, there's actually another amazing project out there comparable to others, again from Sadra and his team. It's called No Brainer, which is a very specialized deep learning framework for 3D image processing, but it actually contains a substantial amount of pre-trained models for different tasks people can just really utilize. And it's in a standardized way, which is really nice. And there's more projects like that out there. And in my opinion, this is really where everything should be moving to. Because again, no one can train every network themselves again over and over because there's just time and resource limitations. Adjacent to that is of course required to share as much about the analysis as possible when you, for example, do include in a publication or any form of presentation. And there are cool and helpful checklists out there. For example, here the machine learning reversibility checklist. I also include the link here. It's from computer science department at McGill, basically outlining a few important steps and checkboxes you would need to make sure you fulfill when sharing your machine learning analysis out there, especially in the publication or other form of presentation. So all of that together, there's actually a lot of things we can do to make machine learning analysis more reproducible. Again, unfortunately, none of this actually won't ever guarantee full reproducibility. But if we combine all of these things, we get a fair stretch to that. So always make sure, even if you apply all these different aspects together, which we of course hope you do, make sure to check things accordingly. But again, just briefly summarize what we've talked about to give maybe like some sort of like a take-home message and things that are hopefully easier to remember. Things that we can address reasonably well is the software using reproducible and shareable computing environments, algorithms, practices, and processes using seeding of randomness, and data via standardizations of data and models. And if we place all of that under version control, even better, because we can keep track of all these different aspects and changes therein. And if we share all of that, that's even one time more better, because then people can reuse it out there, use pre-trained models, and can make use of the work that's already been done, reevaluate things, apply it to new data sets, further validate it, and the alike. So all of that, in my opinion, would be more or less ideal, the ideal scenario for machine learning analysis, depending on any kind of data, but especially neuroimaging, neuroscience data, neuroscientific data. If you do these things and try to combine them, I think you did your fair share of making did this a bit better. But of course, we'll also like to mention there's other things out there. If this is a topic of interest to you, there's this very cool, informative paper called Out of the Box Reversibility, a survey of machine learning platforms that again nicely summarizes what is out there and what can be done. And then again, from the computer science department at McGill, there's a fantastic list of tools that for the depending practice basically lists the tools that are out there. So if you want to have config management, different logging or seeding, versioning, so all of that nicely with links, easy to utilize. So in the end, it's maybe not all that bad. If we do all these things, we could say that when it comes to machine learning analysis, maybe if we focus on neuroimaging, we are in the good place, or we can be in the good place. And with that, if the slides go, yes, let's go. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions regarding anything I talked about in this presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. You can contact me via email or these things called social media, and obviously, please make sure to check the ReproNim website, which has a lot of more information about most of the tools that I basically mentioned here and presented.
Great. Thank you so much, Per. That was very fascinating and comprehensive, and great to see a lot of the sort of real world problems, illustrated and solved in one session. So that's great to see. I'm going to quickly throw on the tape here that next month we're meeting on April 1st. The topic is to be determined. We will. There's a little bit of a fly in the ointment, so we'll solve that. And thank everyone for being here, and then open up the floor to questions if there are any. And to make sure there isn't a gap in questions, I did want to start with one comment to sort of re-emphasize this sharing bit, because one of the keys in sharing is in order to document the re-executability of what you've done. How do you know that I've gotten the exact same thing that you got unless I can validate that I got the same thing? So again, that sharing is very important for validation, so that when you do go forward with that, you know that you're using something that's validated. So that's the other key part of the sharing. And I guess the other question then is, well, no, actually, I'm not going to ask that question. I'll hold on to it. Let anyone else in the audience have any questions? Oh, Steve has his hand up. Go ahead.
More of a comment, really. I certainly understand the pain in the machine learning world of trying to reproduce a number and trying to get it exactly accurate. And I've noticed the same thing in coming from the statistics field that I do, that setting the random seed when you do a lot of analyses, especially if you do randomization tests, is a very important first step. And then as you get deeper, you realize that each statistical package might have a certain set of defaults or a certain linear algebra package that they use that also contributes a little fuzziness to the numbers. And it always seems to me that everyone comes out with a better technique of analyzing data, and the whole hope of the machine learning is to limit or shrink the size of your variance, shrink the limits of your point estimate. And it's a tough nut to crack down sometimes when you're looking at this stuff. You would expect, I can see in computational stuff that you expect to get an exact same answer every time, and it's quite frustrating when you don't. So I appreciate the work that you did to show us how where some of the details, the devils lie in the details.
It's like a very interesting point of when I looked further into things when preparing this, I actually found a lot of work and like movement in the machine learning analysis field apparently is not really focusing on reproducibility in terms of like seeing this randomness things, whatever, but say like, oh yeah, this is just what it is. These are the analysis and the algorithms. So what we need to do is we need to test it and rerun it basically, I don't know, 1,000, 1,000,000 times to evaluate the variability, to then make some sort of like a, maybe more related to like a confidence of like interval confidence of interval. You know what I mean? Sorry.
Yeah, confidence interval.
There's
a fuzziness. There should be a well, I'm used to there being a fuzziness around a point estimate. You get an average. I mean, there's a standard deviation associated with the average, or a confidence interval associated with that, and that seems reasonable to me. But when you get these large computational questions, perhaps it becomes, a lot more difficult to run it enough times that you could, bracket in that confidence interval. So I feel the pain.
So one of the tools that from Satra is, sort of no-brainer collection of things, Quick. It's a, sort of a machine learning based parslator. It's trained on sort of free surfer types of analysis. One of their solutions, as best I understand, and so we sometimes use that as, a prototype, for doing something. And if you run the same brain, twice, you get different answers based on, this kind of thing. So one of their recommendations, there is a parameter on that, which will run it, an ensemble number of times. And so the answer you want is not really the answer of one run of this machine learning thing. It's, the ensemble, average answer across a larger set of things. And I think that reflects kind of the conversation you were just having there, that this idea that run once may not actually be the right way to run some of these things. It's run it 10, 15, 1,000 times in order to get the answer with the correct confidence intervals on it. One more question-ish thing. So because of the impact of random number generators and things like that, would one of your recommendations be that all software developers must, under penalty of law, declare all of their random number seeds and expose those to a controllable setting? The examples you showed, perhaps you were lucky that one, you could find it, or two, the documentation said there was a place to do it. But if that was hidden and wasn't exposed to you, that would be a problem. And yes, you said read the documentation, but documentation is only useful if the programmer exposed that feature.
Yeah, I mean, like when it comes to these setting random seeds, I think that most of the people that were here or will see this, they were like, oh yeah, that's for sure. That's like the thing you always do. Like the first thing you do is setting seeds for randomness. However, I think there's a fair amount of people that do not know that and or do not care. And you're completely right in that, depending on the software, as we saw it here, in the scikit-learn option, it was very comparably easy, right? It would be to random state one. However, one would need that, it's not only the cross-validator function object that has it, but also the classifier itself. Because if we, for example, here use a form of decision tree, this will make a difference. And then when we went to the TensorFlow, so the deep neural network example, this just got increasingly more complex because we set the random seed basically 4 times. And with more time, if we would have more time, I would have shown different examples of what happens if we only set one or the other or a subset of them. Because even with setting 4 of them, we got a different results in the first one based on most likely the processing units. And I remember the ReproNim discussion and event that we had in the Open Science Room in HBM, I think 2 years ago, where we had a very good crowd in there and a very good panel with a lot of people working for a long time in software development, including Satra, including Gael. And especially Gael, I think, was also saying that with these containers, software containers, yes, good idea, we can make use of that. But in the end, we also would need to be concerned or focus on writing better software, right? Because there's only so much you can do with creating virtualized environments. If the software itself is not maybe fully optimized, it's not the right choice of words, but brought up like to the max what it could be regarding these randomness and these operations and algorithmic level, that would also help a great deal. And this may be something that can get lost or not thought about if, for example, we would only use on or focus on virtualization.
Yep, no, I remember that setting and that argument or the concern, that Gael often, it's containerization is just making up for bad programming practices in some senses sometimes. So yeah, that's an important thing to remember. Okay, we've overstayed our welcome, but thank you so much again for presenting. This will be great addition to the collection, and we will meet again in this forum a month from now with someone on April 1st. Oh, it'll be a surprise. So thanks again, Pierre, and thanks the rest of you for hanging on, and we will talk again later.
Thank you,
folks. Stay safe.
Bye. Yes.